Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in Japan. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video on the UK, which has fallen into recession in the fourth quarter of 2023. And on the same day that that was announced, it was also announced that Japan had unexpectedly fallen into recession as well, as it had had 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. And not just that, but it's also lost its position as the third largest economy in the world, behind the USA and China. That's now been taken by Germany, which ironically is also in recession. So there's a big gap between the front two and the rest of the world in terms of global GDP. But in today's video, I want to get into the details as to what's going on in Japan. Why is it in recession? And is there any hope for it coming out and regaining its position as the third largest economy in the world? So in today's video, we'll have a look at what's been going on with GDP, and we'll have a look at where Japan ranks both in total GDP and also GDP per capita. We'll talk about what's going on with the Japanese yen, the currency of Japan, because the weakening of the yen over the last 3 years has had a massive impact on the Japanese economy, because Japan isn't a resource-rich country. It doesn't have lots of natural resources such as Russia does. It depends on manufacturing and technology. So the economy is very dependent on exports. So the value of the yen has a massive bearing on how much money Japan is actually earning. So we'll go through the details as to what's happened with the yen. We'll then have a look at what's been happening with Japanese trade, what's happened to its exports and its balance of trade. We'll then talk about what's going on domestically, because the people in Japan have changed their buying patterns over the last 10 years or so. There has been a lot of deflation over the last 20 years. And as a result of that, the Japanese consumers have got a lot more cautious. So we'll look at what's going on with Japanese consumers, inflation and interest rates. We'll then have a look at what's happening with the population, because the population of Japan is shrinking. It's one of the most advanced economies in the world, and in terms of its birth rate and its death rate, it's flipped completely. So it's now got a declining population. So we'll have a look at those characteristics and talk about what that means for Japan in the future. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think's going on in Japan, whether or not the Japanese authorities are going to be able to fix the problems, and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. But before we get into all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much. I really appreciate the effort that you're going to keep everything going. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for your long-term support. I know it's difficult to keep supporting all different creators. There's only a limited budget that everybody has, but I genuinely appreciate your support. It does help to keep this channel going. Japan is now officially in recession, and the official definition of a recession is when you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. So when your GDP on a 12-month rolling basis has fallen in 2 consecutive quarters. So that's exactly where Japan is right now. So let's have a look at the details of that. This chart shows the 12-month GDP growth rate for Japan, dating back to January 2021. And the bars on this chart are the quarterly postings. So if we start off by looking at the last 2 quarters, which were quarter 3 and quarter 4 for 2023, you can see that Japan posted negative GDP growth of 0.8% in quarter 3, which was its biggest fall at any point in the last 3 years. And they followed that up with a further fall of 0.1% in Q4, which officially plunged Japan into recession. And if we take a step back and have a look at what's been happening over the last 3 years, you can see that in 5 out of the last 10 quarters, Japan has actually posted negative GDP growth. So the economy has clearly been struggling for a while. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, the official GDP figures for the fourth quarter of 2023 have actually resulted in Japan officially now falling from the 3rd largest economy in the world to the 4th largest. So let's have a look at the 8 largest economies in the world as it stands today. The United States remains the largest economy in the world, with total GDP of around $28 trillion, which equates to around $83,000 per person. The world's 2nd largest economy is China, with total GDP of around $18.6 trillion, which equates to around $13,000 per person. So in comparative terms, the USA is more than 30% larger than China on a total GDP basis, but in terms of per capita, it's more than 6 times bigger, which I think is interesting because China has a population that's around 4 times larger than the USA. The third largest economy in the world is now Germany, with total GDP of around $4.7 trillion, which equates to around $56,000 per person. As we've discussed, Japan is now the fourth largest economy in the world, with total GDP of around $4.3 trillion, which equates to around $35,000 per capita. India is now the fifth largest economy in the world, recently overtaking the UK, with total GDP of $4.1 trillion, which equates to around $3,000 per person. The United Kingdom is the sixth largest economy in the world, with GDP of $3.6 trillion, which equates to around $52,000 per head. France is the seventh largest economy with GDP of $3.2 trillion, which equates to $48,000 per person. And Italy is the eighth largest economy with GDP of $2.3 trillion, which equates to around $39,000 per head. This chart shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Japanese yen over the last 5 years. And the reason that I wanted to go back this far is to look at the severe deterioration in the value of the yen that's been seen over the last 3 years. In January 2021, one US dollar was trading for around 103 Japanese yen. Today, it's trading for 150, which represents a fall in value over that time of more than 31%, which for a major currency like the yen is an absolute disaster. This can be classified as a crash. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, the reason that the value of the yen is so important to Japan is because the economy is dependent upon exports. It doesn't have a lot of raw materials that it can sell to the rest of the world. Japan is a manufacturing nation, and it focuses in on things like high-tech products and cars, which it then exports all around the globe. And the fall in the value of the yen has some serious implications for Japan. And I thought it'd be interesting to run through a quick example to illustrate the impact. If you think about a product that's produced in Japan that costs 150 yen, this time 3 years ago, that product would have sold in the international markets for $1.50 because at that point, $1 was trading for around 100 yen. So if the cost was 150 yen, then the price in the international markets would be $1.50. That same product today, if it was still costing 150 yen to produce, would be selling in the international markets for $1. So from an exporter's point of view, that actually represents a potential upside because the cost in Japan is the same as it was 3 years ago, but the price in the international markets could actually be a lot lower. It would have dropped from $1.50 3 years ago to $1 today. And obviously from an exporter's point of view, that represents potential upside because if your product is cheaper, then theoretically it's more attractive to overseas buyers and they'll either buy the same amount or they might buy more. So that represents potential good news. However, if you then think about what that means from an importer's point of view, if you're having to buy things from overseas, this time 3 years ago when you sold your product that was costing 150 yen in the international markets, you were receiving $1.50. So you could then use that $1.50 to buy things to import. Today, you're selling the same product, but you're only receiving $1. So that means compared to this time 3 years ago, you've got around 30% less to be able to buy things to import. And that's one of the problems that Japan is facing because it has a negative balance of trade. It's importing more than it's exporting. And so the fall in the value of the yen means that it's got less purchasing power in the international markets, and that's causing Japan a problem. So let's have a look at what's been happening with the balance of trade. This chart shows the movement in the balance of trade for Japan over the last 12 months. And the balance of trade is basically the difference between the value of all of your exports, so the money that you're receiving in, and the cost of all of your imports, so the money that you're paying out. And as you can see, in 9 out of the last 12 months, Japan has had a negative balance of trade. So it's been paying out more than it's receiving. And actually, when you look at the details, the 3 months where it had a positive balance of trade, that positive figure was very small compared with the negative figures that have been recorded in the 9 other months. And if you look at the figures for January 2024, which are the most recent that have been posted, you can see that it was the biggest loss out of any of the last 12 months. And the fact that Japan is running a negative balance of trade is obviously negative for the economy in the longer term because it means that it's having to run down its reserves. Inflation has been a long-standing problem in Japan, not because they've had too much of it, but actually the opposite. They haven't had enough. Japan has been experiencing long periods of deflation over the last 20 years or so. And as we've talked about in videos recently about China, deflation becomes an absolute nightmare because it's a really difficult spiral to break. If all of your companies are constantly reducing their prices because prices are falling on the shelves, it means that they're having to cut people's wages and everybody is making less profit. And it's a really difficult thing to break away from, as China is now finding out. But recently, Japan did manage to get some inflation back into its economy, but things are now starting to turn the corner again, and there are concerns that Japan is heading once more into a deflationary cycle. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Japan, dating back to the late 1990s. And as you can see, over the last 25 years, Japan has experienced long periods of deflation. Now, if we focus in on the last 5 years, you can see that as Japan came away from the COVID-19 pandemic, it experienced exactly the same thing as the rest of the economies around the world. Demand started to increase, and as a result of that, prices started to go up. And Japan, for the first time in a long time, experienced what it considered to be high levels of inflation. And they peaked at around 4%, which is obviously considerably less than the levels of inflation that we saw in countries like the USA and the UK. But in relative terms, 4% was a very high rate for Japan. However, if we now look at what's been happening over the last 12 months, you can see that in the same way as we've seen in a lot of other countries, inflation has started to come down. And the most recent figures posted for December 23 was an inflation rate of 2.6%, which is the lowest level that Japan has seen for around 2 years and compares to its target rate of around 2%. So it looks like everything's on track. Now, you might be sitting there thinking that the reason that inflation has been coming down in Japan, similar to the rest of the world, is because Japan has been increasing its interest rate. But if we have a look at this chart, which shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Japan over the last 10 years, you can see that 10 years ago, the rate was sitting at 0%. And as a result of the deflation that Japan was experiencing at that time, the rate was actually cut to minus 0.1%, so negative interest rates. And what that means is that basically if you keep your money in the bank, if you decide to save your money rather than spending it, the value of your savings will actually decrease. You'll be hit by charges. So this is designed basically to encourage people not to keep their money in the bank and to go out and spend it, because Japan wanted to increase demand in order to increase prices in order to get some inflation back into the economy. So as you can see, nothing has happened with regards to interest rates over the last 12 months. And despite that, Japan has started to see a reduction in inflation. And the reason that inflation is coming down is because of what's happening with the consumers in Japan. They are very cautious and they are now saving more of their money and spending less. And this is why Japan has fallen into recession. So let's have a look at what's been going on with consumers. This chart shows the monthly movement in household spending in Japan over the last 12 months. And as you can see, in 9 out of the last 12, consumer spending has been in negative territory, so it's been reducing. And if we have a look at what's happened in the most recent quarter, consumer spending was down 0.1% in October, 1% in November, and 0.9% in December. And this chart shows the movement in retail sales, so how much retailers are making over the last 12 months. And as you can see, in 2 out of the last 3 months, retail sales have been down. And in December, retail sales were down 2.9%, which is by far the biggest movement in any of the last 12 months. And one of the reasons why consumers are spending less is that they are very cautious and they are saving a large percentage of their earnings. And this chart shows the household ratio of net savings over the last 12 months. And as you can see, in December 2023, the net savings rate was 60.3%. And if we compare that to the situation in the USA, you can see that there is a massive difference. In December 2023, the personal savings rate in the US was 3.7%, compared with 60% in Japan. And if we look at the movement in the net savings ratio in Japan over the last 10 years, you can see that there has been a clear upward trend. People are saving more. They are more cautious. They're worried about what's going on, and they don't want to spend their money. And you can see that this has been a long-term trend. Even 10 years ago, the net savings ratio was up around 40% in certain months, and it's been increasing ever since. And if we compare that to the situation in the USA, it's markedly different. Between 2014 and 2019, the savings ratio in the USA moved from around 5% to around 7%. There was then a sharp increase during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were forced to stay at home and therefore couldn't go out and spend. A lot of retail institutions were closed, restaurants were shut, and so the level of savings actually spiked at around 30%. However, as soon as the lockdowns were released, we saw the ratio fall below 5%, and it sat at or around that level over the last couple of years. One of the other fundamental problems that Japan is now facing is that it has a declining population. So let's have a look at the population pyramid right now. This chart is Japan's population pyramid. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've looked at population pyramids before. They basically tell us exactly what the population is made up of in terms of male and female and all of the different age categories. The scale on the left-hand side is grouped into age categories from 0 to 4 at the bottom up to 100 plus at the top. And the chart here is split into a blue section and a red section. The blue section is the male population in all of those different age categories, and the red section is the female population. And there are a number of things that stand out when you look at this chart. Firstly, you can see that the female population is considerably more than the male population in virtually every single age group. The biggest single age category is 50 to 54, with 3.8% of the male population and 3.7% of the female population. And as you can see, the pyramid actually tapers down from that point. So every single one of the younger age categories is decreasing in size. And that tells us that Japan has a declining birth rate. The number of people being born each year is declining, and therefore so is the population. But one of the other worrying things about this chart is what's happening at the top. As you can see, the 70 to 74 age range is actually the second largest out of all of these categories. And if you look above that, Japan has a large number of older people who are costing the economy, because in a lot of situations you need to provide social care to keep those people going. So when you compare this to a traditional pyramid, which is obviously pyramid shaped, where you have an increasing birth rate and therefore a growing number of people who are then joining the working population at certain points, they're paying more tax, and so they can support the older generation. When you have a situation like Japan has got right now, it's a real problem, because you've got declining numbers entering the working population, and you've got an aging population that are going to cost the state more money. And just to break out into the detail on that, this chart shows the birth rate for Japan dating back to 1950. And as you can see, the current birth rate is 6.995, or around 7 per 1,000 of population, which equates to around 0.7%. If we now have a look at what's going on with the death rate, you can see that it's currently sitting at around 11.7 per 1,000 of population, which equates to around 1.2%. And when you compare that to the birth rate of 6.995, it tells you that there are around 5 people per 1,000 of population dying in Japan every single year. And that explains why the population is declining. And if we look at this chart, which plots the total population of Japan dating back to 1950, this shows that the population increased from around 85 million in 1950 to a peak of 128 million in 2010. However, over the last 14 years, Japan has seen a gradual decline in its population, and that decline is now accelerating. and the current population of 123 million is forecast to fall to less than 100 million by 2056, which obviously in itself is bad news for Japan, because if you've got less people, then they're generating less income and therefore are paying less taxes, so GDP is likely to fall. But when you look at the population pyramid to Japan and the fact that it's getting older, there's actually going to be a bigger burden on the state to support those older people. And as a result of the aging population, it's likely that there will be an acceleration in the decline in GDP. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because firstly, it's interesting to note when one of the largest economies in the world actually falls into recession, particularly when it's unexpected, because nobody was actually expecting Japan to post these sort of figures for the final quarter of 2023. They were expecting growth and therefore Japan not to be in recession. So that was a surprise in itself. But when you dig down into the details and look at what's been going on in Japan, it really is quite worrying. 20 years ago, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. And at that time, a lot of commentators were saying that it was going to overtake the USA. And that's very similar to what we've got with China right now. A lot of people have been saying for the last 5 years or so that China will eventually overtake the USA. But what we've seen in Japan is that that didn't happen. And actually, for the last 25 years, Japan has been struggling. There was a crash in the Japanese markets at the end of the 1990s, which resulted in a long period of deflation. And Japan has really struggled to shake that off. And as we've looked at in today's video, it did actually get into a period of inflation following the release of the COVID-19 lockdowns. However, that effect seems to be wearing off. And as we've seen from the consumer spending and savings data, Japanese consumers appear to be very cautious and don't want to go out and spend. And as a result of that, consumer spending is down, demand is falling, and prices are now coming back down. And there's a real danger that Japan will also slip back into a deflationary cycle. And I think there's a lot of interesting comparables here to what's going on in China right now, because China has had a major knock from its property sector. The property sector really boosted the growth of the economy over the last 20 years or so. That bubble has now burst, and it's really difficult to see it ever coming back because the property developers are in dire straits. They don't have access to any cash. They can't build out all of the apartments that they pre-sold, and the government has really painted itself into a corner. And China has now entered into a deflationary cycle, and it'll be really fascinating to see whether or not the stimulus efforts that the Chinese government are announcing, they recently cut mortgage rates to try to boost demand in the property sector. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they can get the economy back into positive territory, or if it follows a very similar pattern to what's happened in Japan over the last 25 years, and China doesn't overtake the USA as the largest economy in the world. But in terms of what's going on in Japan, one of the really worrying factors is what's going on with the population. As we've seen in today's video, the population is aging in Japan, and it's also declining because they've got a falling birth rate. And the reason they've got a falling birth rate is firstly, there's a smaller number of people. So obviously when you've got fewer people, they don't have as many children in total terms. But also the sentiment in Japan is very different. People are worried about starting families from an economic point of view. It's expensive, and also females want to work longer. They don't want to have a break to have children. And as a result of that, the birth rate has been declining for a long period of time. And in 2023, the number of children born actually fell below 800,000, which was the first time since records began in 1899. So this is a serious crisis. It isn't a short-term blip, it is a long-term trend. And when you've got a declining population and also an aging population, that has a massive impact on GDP because you've got less people entering the workforce, and you've also got people leaving the workforce who you then have to support potentially for the next 30 or 40 years. And that's exactly what we've got in Japan right now. And so all the fundamentals point to the fact that Japan's GDP fall is likely to be continuing over the next 20 to 30 years. Japan is very unlikely to get back to being the second largest economy or even the third largest economy in the world as a result of these dynamics. And when you take a step back and look at the overall picture, it doesn't look very good for Japan's point of view over the next 5 to 10 years. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
Sabe, gente, o que tá acontecendo aqui agora? Eu fui chamar a atenção dele. Não grita comigo, não. Não grita comigo, não. Sabe por quê, gente? Olha o que ele fez, ó. Olha, olha. Não foi eu. Foi você. Foi você. Foi. Foi você. Foi você, sim. Não adianta. Gente, e agora? Como é que carrega celular? Não grita comigo. Não grita comigo. Olha, cara. Ô, bicudo. Escuta só. Eu não vou falar mais. Cuida. Ele não assume isso. Olha, bicudo. Eu não sei mais o que fazer. Porque o bicudo... Não foi eu, foi. Claro que foi. Ó. Aí ele toma banho, aí ele se revolta. Foi. Por que você fez isso? Gente, haja carregador.